Cheaters by Lynn Bonner. Detective Fiction Weekly. The 24th of September, 1927. A son of fact, who on at least 3 occasions had found himself on the inside, looking out, sentenced for breaches of the law, has every reason to heap curses upon the heads of a band of swindlers who were run to earth by the minions of Keys Winter, Deputy Attorney General of the state of New York. They not only made him an innocent party to their depredations, but they put him afoul of the Martin Anti-Stock Fraud Act, caused him to face 2 prosecutions on the charge of stock swindling, and cost him a sum of money estimated variously at 100 to half a million. G. Graham Rice, who on stock selling business is a list, called mailing list in polite language, but more generally referred to as a sucker list. Without such a list, a stock salesman, legitimate or otherwise, is helpless. He has nowhere to start. Therefore, when a crew of high-pressure operators, whose playground is the brightest part of Broadway, found themselves in immediate peril of being broke, they cast about for a scheme that would put them in funds in a hurry. Like the monarch who offered his kingdom for a horse, these birds of prey would have given anything just then for a sucker list. But sucker lists are the chief asset of the stock game, and they are tightly guarded. It was not easy to get one. On the moment, the gang included Jimmy Red Rankin, Billy Neely and Quinn, all of more or less unsavory reputation. Slippery Dick Guest was named as the brains of the gang, and as on many previous occasions, he escaped capture when the trap was sprung. The clue that gave the authorities their start looked like a chance to get $1 million. 57th Street, wherein were vested lists which are said to have been. At this instance, what had cost Rice is a matter of guesswork, but that it had an intrinsic value aside from income possibilities is a fact. For each name on a good list represents an expense of from $10 upward on Wall Street. Consequently, one that it was worth watching gave the men cause to enter Rice's office at night and purloin the list. But this plan had to be abandoned upon reflection. So, on the theory that there are more ways of killing a cat than by choking it with butter, Quinn and the others decided to make the watchman a party to their plan without his knowledge. Thus, on a selected night, the man who had been cultivating the acquaintance of the watchman appeared at the building and engaged the guardian in friendly conversation. Then he suggested a friendly drink, and by this means lured the man away from his post of duty. It was not long before the man was drunk, helpless and unaware that he had been betrayed by his supposed friend. This all sounds very melodramatic, but we must keep in mind that truth is stranger than fiction, and that this particular crowd of swindlers, at least one of whom was involved in the fleecing of a New York state banker who since has gone to his grave, is given to dramatics. While the watchman lay helpless a few blocks away, guarded by one of the gang, others gathered at the building for lookout purposes. While 2 were ransacking Rice's offices, they used a beautiful young woman, a former stage and screen notable who was at that time acting as hostess in a nightclub. The list they stole, she, dressed in splendid evening finery, stood outside the building, chatting merrily with 2 young men in dinner suits to throw off police or others who might become inquisitive. In due time, the men who had committed the burglary rejoined the group on the sidewalk, and all left the vicinity of the crime. After getting the list, the swindlers hid it away for several days. Then they opened an office, using names identical with those of several prominent banking firms in Wall Street. The list which they had obtained was that of people who had invested in Idaho copper stocks, one of several then being promoted by Rice. The Attorney General has charged that Rice, owning the bulk of this company's stock, purchased at 10 cents a share, had created a market from 50 cents at the start to as high as $6 per S-hair, and that in that way he had swindled the public out of millions of dollars. The fact remains, however, that at the time Rice's list was stolen, the stock was quoted at several dollars per hair and, therefore, of immense value to the 100%ers who had looted the promoter's office. Gigantic in potentialities. When they had opened offices, the swindlers went to work on the persons who appeared on the list as shareholders. In complaints which were received by Winter, it was alleged that these men called their victims by telephone and represented themselves as Rice, that they represented a forthcoming drop in the market and urged the owners of the securities to send them into such and such banker for deposit and disposal at the best possible figure. How much stock was sent in to the swindlers probably never will be known, but it is a fact that at the time their plot was blown up, they were awaiting the receipt of several $100,000 worth. As soon as this stock should get into their hands, they would sell it on the Boston curb and present to the shareholder utterly valueless stock in some other proposition. Thus, whatever they received for the Idaho Copper shares on the Boston curb was all profit, naturally. This was a game which had to be worked fast because George Graham Rice is himself too shrewd an operator to remain long in ignorance of the fact that something was wrong, whether he was aware of the theft of his list or not. Any sudden raid on the market, involving a sudden drop in price of the stock or one complaint from one of his shareholders, would be sufficient to stir him into action. And it so happened that it was an inquiry of the latter sort which did finally give him an inkling that all was not right with his affairs. But before Rice knew he had been victimized, Winter, through underground channels, had learned of the enterprise and had set his Secret Service to work to land the gang. The swindle, though only about a week old, seemed so gigantic in potentialities that he determined to try and get the gang in such a way that they could not by any possibility escape a term in prison. He first had 2 of his operatives set places in the gang, and these men later stood for arrest and indictment in connection with the swindle without disclosing their real identity. Their chief duty was to obtain some of the stolen securities and, upon pretense of selling them, to return marked money to the gang. They actually did obtain a batch of the securities, but the amount involved was so small that they were simply checked and recorded for future use as evidence, and no money was turned over for them. Because the operatives had been told several $100,000 worth would be received in the mails within a few days, and it was decided to get the larger amount in hand. For these Winter men to get into the confidence of the gang was not such an easy task, it may be imagined, and they were let into the plot only after a series of negotiations over costly luncheons and suppers. The woman is found their arrest also, almost destroyed Winter's plan for rounding up the real crooks, and it was only the quick-wittedness of the men in keeping their identities secret that prevented complete collapse of the structure built up by the Attorney General. While Winter was working on the case, Rice tumbled to the fact that someone was tampering with his investors, and a search revealed to him that his list had been stolen. He employed private detectives to try and locate the thieves. Then the city police came into the case, and thus 3 agencies were out after the band, though the state's men were in the lead. It was city police who arrested Winter's Secret Service agents, though they were not aware of their connection when they took them in. The agents went into hiding, and the Winter men kept in touch with some of them, still pretending they're incognito. Up to this time, heads of the proposition had not been known to the Winter operatives. Only one of them learned that the owner of a leading nightclub, the former actress of stage and screen, was the sweetheart of the chiefs. Men in the meters began to lay siege upon the club night after night. Correctly attired in evening clothes and armed with plenty of money, the operatives haunted that club, currying the favor of the pretty girl. The rest of the gang, ultimately. They gained her confidence to such an extent that she revealed to them that she would, on a given afternoon, meet Jimmy Quinn in the Waldorf Astoria at 4th Street and 5th Avenue. At the appointed time, Jimmy was there, and a squad of Winter's men. The girl and Jimmy were taken to Winter's office, and Jimmy was held on charge of grand larceny. To make sure he should not get away, he was taken to Bronx County, where he was wanted in connection with the swindling of a colleague. As soon as he was freed, he was taken to Tombs Prison there before obtaining bail. As this resort, he is awaiting trial, along with Rankin, in the same case. Rankin, like Quinn, was able to obtain bail and his freedom. But it was not long before he was again in the toils. In the course of their hunt, the Winter forces learned that one Billy Neely, an ex-convict, had opened an apartment house, an exclusive apartment, it may be said, in that only proved crooks or ex-convicts could obtain lodgings therein. The doors of the place, which was located on West 72nd Street, New York, were elaborately armored and secured by heavy bolts to provide against assault by pestiferous policemen. A keen and continued search of speakeasies, nightclubs, and other known haunts of the high-pressure gang having failed to produce any more of the hunted men, it was determined to raid Neely's place. Thus, one afternoon, state troopers, Secret Service operatives, post office men, and city detectives went to the 72nd Street house in force. They quickly surrounded the building, and two stalwart state troopers went to the door of Neely's apartment. On a technicality, they rang the bell, received no answer. Then they hammered on the armored door with their automatics. Soon, with much rattling of chains and sliding of bolts, the door was cautiously opened. A face appeared in the aperture. It was that of Rankin. Before he could close the door again, the state troopers were inside the apartment, guns in hand. Other officers followed. A search revealed that Rankin was the only person on the premises, and he was again taken to Winter's office for investigation on a charge separate from the Idaho copper transaction. Like Quinn, he is now awaiting trial on the latter charge. Well, Quinn and Rankin were the only two bagged in this case. Their alleged activities in Idaho copper turned the attention of Winter to George Graham Rice and his affairs. The result was that Winter began two prosecutions, charging Rice with Idaho copper and Columbia Emerald Development Corporation stocks. In the former case, which has been treated in another article, Rice beat the case on a technicality, and the state appealed from the decision of the lower court. In the Columbia Emerald case, the state was victorious and Rice took an appeal. Neither has been finally decided, as this is written. The Wall Street iconoclast in the Columbia Emerald affair, which had to do with an emerald mine in the South American country of that name. Rice was accused of taking an old and abandoned property and, by means of false engineering reports, and boosting the stock in his newspaper, the Wall Street Iconoclast, of placing a $2 million value on a property worth, at most, only a few $1,000s. With him as defendants in this action were the Wall Street Iconoclast, Frank J. Silver, Columbia Emerald Development Corporation, Nash Rockwood, Edmund J. McNamara, and Frederick H. Lewison. The state obtained a preliminary injunction under which Rice and all others concerned were prevented from promoting or selling the stock with certain restrictions. Part of the court record in this case is illuminating, as showing the alleged methods employed by Rice in his dealings with the public. A memorandum to the Supreme Court, prepared by Deputy Attorney General Winter, first tells of the Wall Street Iconoclast thus. The fraud in this case may be summarized briefly as follows. The periodical, The Wall Street Iconoclast, is published by defendant Wall Street Iconoclast Inc. and is edited by defendant George Graham Rice in the city of New York, with a large circulation throughout the United States. It is said Rice sends out about 600,000 of each issue, paying first-class mailing charges. This periodical is a tipster sheet, dressed up to appear as giving its readers information worth $6 for the inside track on securities. It is pretended to establish a relation of confidence and trust between its editor and its readers. It consistently and continuously in weekly editions. Comments on the stocks of 4 corporations: Idaho Copper, General Mines, Belcher Extension, and the defendant Columbia Emerald Development Corporation. To further inspire confidence and trust in its news and advice about these securities, it publishes a large number of letters from correspondents appealing for information and advice. Together with the editor Rice's answers to the same, in certain instances misrepresenting the value and condition of the securities held by the inquirer and advising the sale of such inquirer's securities and the purchase with the proceeds of the 4 securities promoted by this periodical. Nowhere in this periodical is there any disclosure that the defendant Rice or the Rice interests have any interest in the profits which will accrue to the defendants from the public's purchase of the 4 securities sponsored by this periodical. But, on the other hand, there is a studious concealment of such fact, in direct violation of the relation of trust and confidence that the periodical is calculated to inspire. Matched sales. To further inspire the relation of trust and confidence, the periodical contains inflammatory attacks upon the New York Stock Exchange in the interests of the public, and also to induce the public purchase sponsored stocks. It contains cunning references to quotations of these stocks from transactions on the Boston curb market. Purchases and sales, which the testimony of defendant's accountant Rice and the transcript of the defendant brokers conclusively demonstrate, were cross or matched sales. This latter reference means sales where a person in control of a stock sells a given number of shares to himself in the open market at a price determined by him, the transaction being intended to show activity. The stock does not actually progressively advance by this method. It is known as rigging the market, and there have been a number of cases where stock exchange operators have been expelled by that organization for engaging in the practice. In addition to the boosting in the iconoclast, the Attorney General charged that Rice used a corps of high-pressure salesmen to induce the public to invest in Columbia Emerald stock, of which he owned or exercised control over practically that was available to the public. High finance. To the emerald mine itself, the state presented a graphic historical picture, stating in part, with reference to an affidavit filed by the defense. The history of the Sumandoka mines, owned by the defendant Columbia Emerald Corporation, is set forth with great detail, disregarding its romantic verbiage. It boldly discloses that these mines, although known for history and to the public generally, were permitted to lay buried for over 2 centuries, until 1896, when they were resuscitated by the Colombian government, which produced nothing. That, in 1919, some German speculators attempted a promotion which proceeded no farther than an option. That, in December 1919, the original promoters of the present project, the McFadden Gross Group, obtained options and transferred the mines to the Colombian Emerald Syndicate, which started to sell their stock on the New York curb market at $15 1/2 to $30 a share in October to December 1919, representing $6 to $8 million for the 400,000 shares at a time, when they did not even own the property, and even their options were of dubious, if of any value. This promotion, according to Bredger, witness went on the rocks, and that corporation, Colombian Emerald Syndicate, was petitioned in bankruptcy in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, with the stock of unsold emeralds to a dummy for McFadden for $7,700. Thereafter, according to Bredger, in 1924, the Shebo Emerald Corporation was organized by McFadden and took over the identical property now owned by the Louison interests, and again promoted a stock jobbing proposition on very little production. After this unhappy career, according to Bredger, the well-known Louison interests were introduced into the picture and organized the defendant Columbia Emerald Development Corporation to take over and operate this unfortunate property. The two mines were thereupon, in the latter part of 1924, transferred by the Chiva Emerald Company to defendant Columbia Emerald Development Corporation for the entire capital stock of that corporation, consisting of 1 million shares of no par value. The Lewisson interests thereupon paid defendant Columbia Emerald Development Corporation $51,000 cash and received 550,000 shares of the stock, leaving 450,000 tied up in escrow for the benefit of the Chiba Corporation. A spoonful of emeralds. Shortly afterward, 100,000 shares of this stock was returned to the treasury of the Columbia Emerald Development Corporation. 50,000 from the Chiva Corporation and 50,000 from the Lewisson interests. According to Bredger, therefore, the entire history of these Samandoko mines was one of failure, and as the record established, it ran true to form up to the time when this action was filed against these defendants. The brief then outlines operation of the mines from December 1924 until May 1926, a period of 17 months, and states that during this period only a few hundred carats of saleable emeralds were actually produced, which were worthless because of the flaws and the light green color. This spoonful of emeralds, the state continues, was produced at a cost of $62,000, a net loss to the company during that period of $57,000, without including sales expense and the cost of cutting, $3 to $5 per carat. The statement is then made that Lewisson put approximately $100,000 into the enterprise up to February 1926 and had sold to the public, in a period of about 15 months, only about 2,500 shares of stock. The state's contention: it was at this time that Rice came into the picture, the state alleging that his agents obtained an option on the 100,000 shares of treasury stock previously mentioned, he agreeing to pay $1 per share, and also an option on the 400,000 shares, more or less, held by Lewisson. With that held in escrow for the Chiva Corporation and others, it was charged that this deal left only 2,500 shares out of 1 million free in the hands of the public. Within a few weeks, it was charged. Rice, operating in the name of A.B. Brown, began to sell the stock, starting it off at $1.50 per share. Soon it rose to $2 due. The state charged to manipulation by Rice. The Attorney General cited one day's trading wherein a witness alleged that Rice sold on the Boston curb 700,000 shares of stock and that it was all bought by the Wall Street Iconoclast, his newspaper. The state contended that this huge transaction, representing several $1 million in commissions to brokers of $14,000, was made possible through Rice lining up 1,700 investors to purchase Columbia Emerald, General Mines and other sponsored stocks, that he obtained their purchase money in advance and just made the gesture as a matter of form, although he was instructed to make out the stock certificates in the names of the 1,700 investors, and did so, sending the certificates by registered mail. Rice's culpability: it is the state's contention, regardless of any other consideration, lay in the fact that he guided them to buy stock, controlled by him, at prices fixed by him, without disclosing that he was the seller. The relation between Rice and his customers, said the plea to the court, was one of confidence and trust. They were his clients, looking to him for his advice in the purchase and sale of stock, and for the selection of independent brokers who would represent them in the negotiations on the Boston curb market to procure the best price in that market. Such a broker would need to be free to select the highest price. Instead of this, Rice selected brokers on the Boston Exchange who admittedly represented him and dealt with him as the principal, buying stocks from other brokers employed by Rice to sell Rice's own stocks. This arrangement offends one's ideas of common honesty and decency, placing, as it does, Rice's customers in a helpless position of being obliged to take what Rice has already predetermined that he shall sell to them, and depriving them of the independent services of a broker who may negotiate at arm's length with his antagonists. A skillful fighter. In other words, the state charges that Rice was playing both ends against the middle, operating his newspaper as a come on to bring lambs to the shearing table. How much Rice or anybody else reaped from these operations, originally revealed through the theft of his list by the Broadway dynamiters, is not known, but it is said to have run into millions. Lewisohn, the state pointed out, made $1 on every share of his 400,000, which may have been sold after the first 100,000 shares of Treasury stock option to Rice had been disposed of. Assuming that all was sold at an overpar price, the net return to Lewisohn, after deducting expenses, would be $300,000. Few men in Wall Street are more skillful in market affairs than George Graham Rice, despite the fact that he has been behind bars several times in his career. He has put up one of the stiffest fights that the Idaho copper affair, under Winter's strict enforcement of the Martin Act, has ever encountered. He has surrounded himself with an array of brilliant lawyers, spared no expense to prove his operations were legitimate, and will probably, if necessary, carry the fight to the Supreme Court of the United States. End of Cheaters by Lynn Bonner.